Well, hello and welcome to the Eagle and Child podcast. I'm so glad that you've joined us today. I'm Layla Nahavandi, your host, and my very special guest today is Dr. David Campbell. Welcome, David. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thank you.
It's so good to see you. And Dr. David Campbell is the Pope in residence at Theos University. He is just an absolute genius. We all love him so much. I'm sure many people who are watching have taken many of his courses, has done a lot of study, extensive study in theology, also produced a number of books, published a number of books, which we will share more about at the end if you want to know more about David and his ministry. And his wife, Elaine, they have also just served the church in many different areas, leading churches, pastoring churches for many years. And at the moment, he's helping to lead a church in Michigan as well. So he's never a dull moment in the Campbell family. And we're really excited to spend some time with you today, David. We're looking at Charles E.B. Cranfield. Charles E.B. Cranfield.
Cranfield was my doctoral supervisor in Durham.
Wow.
And when I had back in the dark mists of time, practically back to the book of Genesis when I was young, I was finishing a Master of Divinity degree in Toronto, and I felt called to do a PhD in New Testament studies. And I had also a very strong supernatural call, with sort of the signs confirming to go to England. And so my sort of mentor at the time was a man called Richard Longnecker. And he is quite a well-known New Testament scholar, very godly man. And he recommended Cranfield. His number two recommendation was Marcus Barth, who was the son of Karl Barth, who was a New Testament professor in Basel. But I didn't want to go into a German-speaking environment, in terms of the possibility of maybe having to write a thesis in German.
Wow, yeah, that's
beyond my
intense.
capacity. I did have to teach myself to read German.
Wow.
Although to this day, I couldn't order a coffee in Stuttgart. I can understand German. Anyway, so I traipsed off, and I had no clue where Durham was, and if there's anyone in England listening to this, they'll have a laugh, because I thought it was somewhere just outside of London. It was anything but. Like saying that Perth is a suburb of Melbourne. So anyway, off I went and landed in September of 1977. And I discovered that there was two very, very well-known New Testament scholars at Durham. I mean, there was more than that, obviously, in the theology department. There was two particularly renowned, one of which was Cranfield, and the other was a man called C.K. Barrett. And Professor Barrett was a very outgoing, gregarious guy who had a very high profile, wrote all sorts of commentaries and so on, and had a whole pile of research students, of doctoral students. And Cranfield had me. And I thought, this is a bit odd. And then I discovered that in his entire career, I was only the second PhD student he'd ever accepted.
No way. That's amazing.
And I really was aware of the fact that God had opened the door. We negotiated for quite a while, writing back and forth in terms of the thesis topic, and he basically dictated it. It was something that he had wanted to do himself, but felt he had a heart condition at the time. He was 62, and he felt that he wouldn't live to be able to do it. In the event, he lived to be a few months shy of 100 years old, so he could.
But he would have been fine.
So, but that's what God used to get me into the country, and and a lot of other things happened while I was there. I wound up starting a church on the university campus. My wife, Elaine, whom you've met, was nursing at the local hospital. She came to the church, and that's how we met. And the church then and then we went back to Canada, and the church carried on and planted a number of other congregations, and is still, flourishing to this day. And we're there twice a year
awesome.
still. So it's
So
a wonderful
awesome.
story.
Yeah.
So there was a whole, cavalcade of things happened during that time. But I didn't realize, sometimes you meet people and you don't realize the impact they have in your life until afterward. And he was certainly one of those. And I just, God gave me the privilege of being able to see him again about 5 or 6 years before he died. He was well into his 90s. But he was, his health was declining, but he was perfectly lucid mentally. He hadn't lost anything. And I was just able to say thank you for all that you deposited into my life. And he like Professor G.K. Beale that I've worked with, was very concerned on the pastoral level. They were scholars who are also pastors, or at least were not necessarily full-time pastors, but they had a pastoral concern. Their teaching, they wanted their teaching to impact people at the congregational level.
So good.
And that's what kept, that sort of kept him grounded, in the sense that you can read commentaries, and as well as I do, you can read commentaries that are just a pile of academic information.
Yeah.
The way I test a commentary is, can I get something out of it that I can actually preach on?
That's great.
Person sitting there who may never have been to college or anything can actually get something out of it that will impact their life. And Cranfield is like that. I mean, it requires a bit of translation. So does a lot of Beale stuff, but if you're trained, you can take it, and there's real spiritual food in it.
So good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, can you tell us maybe a little bit about Cranfield and his life? What formed him spiritually? How did he get into the academy and all the things that he did? What was his story?
Well, he had a very good education, although it wasn't in a private school, which in England are called public schools. But he had a very good education. He started learning Greek and Latin at a young age, which in those days, in good British schools, which were called grammar schools, you could have that. So he studied at Cambridge, is where he got master's degree. He got a bachelor's, master's degree, and never actually did a doctorate, and neither did Professor Barrett. And Cranfield was slightly contemptuous of the need for a PhD. He didn't really see it, see that it had all that much bearing. But he had brilliant command of the languages for a start. So if you read his commentary on Romans, which was the top commentary when it came out in the 1970s, and I just don't think there's ever been anything written like it. And the reason is, number one, when he quotes the church fathers, he quotes them in the original. So if you can't read Latin, you're out of luck. Same with German. He'll quote German in the original. He's quoting Luther or somebody else. And he just assumed that if you were a true scholar, that you'd read, at least that you would be able to read Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French, and German. And you'd have a reading knowledge of those languages. And so, but he was a chaplain in the war. In the Second World War, he was a chaplain to German prisoners of war. And he spoke German fluently, and I think that experience gave him enormous amount of compassion pastorally. And subsequent to that, I don't think he actually ever held, he was raised a Methodist. And at some point in his university studies, he had a conversion to Presbyterianism.
Wow.
And from that moment on, he had a very strong commitment to Reformed theology. He didn't have much time for Methodists and Arminians. And whereas Professor Barrett was a raving Methodist and was a Methodist, he would go around preaching all the time. And the two of them had a kind of a rough and tumble relationship.
That's funny.
They were opposite. Cranfield was Presbyterian, Barrett was Methodist. Cranfield was left-wing politically, Barrett was right-wing politically, but Cranfield was more conservative theologically. And Cranfield was an extreme introvert, and Barrett was a great extrovert. So they lived beside each other, just across the road from each other.
No way.
So it was, but you know, Durham was a happening place. I arrived in Durham, and you know, anyone that is listening to this that knows anything about New Testament studies will recognize the name of Ben Witherington. And Ben and I arrived on the same day. Ben and his wife Anne and we lived in the same completely unheated student accommodation.
No.
Anyone that, you know, lives in the north of England and there's no heat, it's dire.
Oh, yeah.
He you know, he was very focused on a call to academic teaching, and he has gone on to become, you know, one of the best known American Testament scholars. He's still teaching at Asbury Seminary, even though he's a few months older even than me. So and Ben was a Methodist, still is a Methodist, and of course that was part of Barrett's attraction. So, you know, it was a kind of a Calvinist versus Arminian controversy.
Did they have debates on campus? Did they do anything like that?
Well, I think they took pot shots at each other, and Cranfield certainly did in his writings, because Barrett had written a commentary in Romans as well.
Wow.
So, but yeah, he was. I went to see him the first time I went to see him. I was quite nervous, and you know, I didn't know how this was going to go, and you know, because he was very shy and introverted, it didn't make it any easier.
Of course. Yeah.
But anyway, we sat in his room and talked and chatted about things and so on, and what I was going to do. And at the end of it, I summoned my courage and I asked him, "Would you pray for me?" And he said, "Certainly." And I closed my eyes. When I opened my eyes, after he said amen, he was down on his knees on the floor of his living room.
Oh, wow.
And it was quite moving, actually. When I went to see him a few years ago in his 90s, I said, "You know, Mr. Cranfield, when I first came to see you the very first day in the same room of his house in Western Hill in Durham, I said, you prayed for me. I said, could I have the privilege now of praying for you?" Wow. Which I did. When I left his house, I was in tears, actually. It was very moving. So, you know, but he taught me a lot. He had very, very high standards, ruthlessly high standards. Everything I wrote would come back, you know, crossed out. At the bottom of the page. It was so discouraging.
Oh, no.
One day, I said to him in frustration, a little bit of frustration, because he'd given me a lecture for about 10 minutes on use of the word surely.
Okay.
So if I had written a sentence, Paul surely said, or you could write the sentence, surely Paul said. Now, to you and I and any other average person, what's the difference?
Yeah,
but to him, there's a big difference. To say surely Paul said was completely different than saying Paul surely said. And I think that the gist of it was to say surely Paul said was putting you were claiming much higher degree of certainty than if you said Paul surely said. That was more modest way of putting it. Anyway, I got this whole thing and went, and
very
finally,
pedantic.
I said, Mr. Cranfield, I said, I'm just, I don't know exactly what I said, but it's like, you're picky. But I didn't say, I dare say you're picky. But I said, your standards, is it really necessary to put so much emphasis on such minor matters? And he just looked at me very seriously and he said, David, he said, God created language for the purpose of the proclamation of the gospel. We need to be very careful in our use of it. And he just looked, and I just said, well, yes, sir. There's nothing I could say.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a revelation. How profound was that?
Yeah,
Where
powerful.
did you get that from?
Yeah.
And so, his view was that you had to be absolutely clear, and he would think and ruminate. And if he was writing, a page of his commentary or something, he would go out on long walks and think and think and think until he got exactly right what he wanted to say.
Wow.
So, some scholars just sit down and write off the top of their head, it seems, and they can be careless and verbose and whatnot. But if you read him, it's obvious that he's pondered and thought about very, very carefully about everything he's saying. And so to, what Paul has to say, he has a magnificent line, which I think I wrote down and sent to you, which I can, if I can click the right buttons here and not in our recording, I'll read it off to you. He said this, and this is in his commentary on Romans, where Paul says in Romans 8, he talks about Abba Father. And he just makes this statement: for to address the true God by the name of Father with full sincerity and seriousness will involve seeking wholeheartedly to be and think and say and do that which is pleasing to him.
Wow, beautiful.
And what can you say to that? That is what I can say to it is that I've lost your picture now, and I don't know how to get back. You're back.
I'm back. Okay. Great.
I'm sorry. I'm going on here, rabbiting on, and I should just shut up and let you.
No, this is so brilliant. And the fact, obviously, like with any of our guests that we've had in the past, the people that we're featuring, like nobody's known them. So it's just wonderful to be able to have like insight into the relationship that you had with Cranfield and him as a person. So I'd love to sort of move on from his bio just into what's he known for. So you mentioned his Romans commentary. Are there any big events or big works that he is known for sort of throughout church history or in the academic world?
Well, you can imagine from what I've said that he was very careful and took a long time to do anything. And again, by contrast with Professor Barrett, who wrote books till the cows came home, wrote commentaries and articles and so on, Cranfield was fairly sparse. He devoted himself to writing an outstanding commentary on the Gospel of Mark, which was published by Cambridge University Press in a series where CFD Mole, Charlie Mole, who is a good friend of Cranfield's and a very fine conservative scholar, wrote the parallel commentary on Colossians, I think. There were a number of them published. Anyway, Cranfield wrote that, and then he wrote his 2-volume commentary on Romans. And he wrote a book titled On Romans after he retired, which was a collection of articles largely refuting what's now called the New Perspective on Paul, which was advanced by Cranfield's successor at Durham, was a man called James Dunn, and Cranfield didn't know very much of him. And Dunn, along with N.T. Wright and others, advanced a different perspective called the New Perspective on Romans. and Paul's relationship with rabbinic Judaism and so on, which Cranfield disagreed with. Part of one of the points of that was that Cranfield believed very much in the atonement involved the appeasing of the anger of God. And that was very clear to him in his exegesis of Romans chapter 3, whereas Wright doesn't believe in that at all. And so Cranfield wrote a very densely argued book entitled On Romans, in which he takes all that apart. So, but he really didn't, and then he wrote articles. He wrote a number of articles, some of which were devotional, actually, in nature rather than academic. But there wasn't a large volume of material because he was more concerned at, well, you know, he would agonize over everything he wrote. And then when the International Critical Commentary was the first commentary series in the English language, it goes back to the late 1890s. The publishers, who were called T&T Clark, and Cranfield was friendly with the last of the Clarks, and who were also, I think, rather eccentric British people, although they lived in Edinburgh, but I think they were English. Anyway, they decided that they would update the whole series, and Cranfield was the New Testament editor of that. Now, only a number of volumes were ever produced. Professor Barrett actually produced a commentary on the Book of Acts, and Davies and Allison produced a commentary on Matthew, and I think there were several others that were done, but T&T Clark ran out of steam. They're very, very expensively priced, and so the series didn't really take off, but he was the editor of that, and that's one of the things that he did. And of course, he edited. You can imagine that when Professor Barrett wrote his commentary in Acts and Cranfield was the editor, he took great delight taking his red pen to his adversary, his nemesis, just as much as he took the red pen to me.
Crazy.
Professor Barrett lived to be nearly 100 as well. So there were,
something in the water in Durham.
Something in the water in Durham, yeah. Yeah. So
crazy. Wow. So what sort of impact has Cranfield had on academia and New Testament studies and all of that sort of stuff today? And why should we, as the 21st century church, engage with his work, his writing? What sort of legacy do you think he's left for us?
Well, I think he had I think he understood Paul as well as anyone has since Calvin. And Cranfield cut through a lot of the guff. I mean, he said to me, "You don't need to quote from the latest Tübingen thesis." He didn't have much time for that. He said, read Calvin, read Augustine, you know, read Chrysostom. He loved Chrysostom, and Luther and so on. And, you know, so he had a kind of a grasp of the historic view of the church. And he felt that academic theology had sunk into a lot of navel gazing of everybody reading everybody else's theses and that sort of thing, and losing perspective. And I think he had quite a profound understanding of Paul. I mean, one example would be in his understanding of Romans chapter 7, where Paul says, you know, I'm sold under sin, and, you know, who will deliver me from this body of death, and the good that I want to do, I cannot do. His exegesis of that is absolutely profound. It's absolutely profound. And I think he demonstrated beyond the shadow of a doubt that Paul is speaking of Christian experience. And of course, that came out of his perspective, that he had a deep understanding of the seriousness of sin. And that you know, that on the one hand, we acknowledge the work of Christ and what he's done for us, but on the other hand, we have to realize that in this life, you know, we're dealing every day with a sin nature. And so his idea was that, you know, for the first time, we have power to fight back. That's Romans 6. And he also, in terms of, you know, you look at Romans 6, which is slavery to sin. You look at Romans 7, which deals with the law, freedom from the law. And you look at Romans 8, which is the life of the Spirit. And he pointed out, you have to read the 3 chapters as one. Paul
Wow.
is talking about different aspects of the same thing, and you can't separate them. So you can believe that someone is sold under sin and can't do anything that they really want to do. They can't fully do it. But at the same time, you can also believe that the Holy Spirit has come and given us power.
Yeah, so good.
He had a brilliant insight in, where it says in Romans 1, the just shall live by faith. And it can equally be translated. And if you look in the margin of the ESV, it'll say, the he who is righteous by faith shall live. So that you change the word order, because as you know, in Greek, the word order is a little bit fluid. In English, it can be translated sometimes. So he translated it, he who is just or righteous by faith shall live. And then he said, that's the structure of Romans 1-8. He who is righteous by faith is Romans chapters 1-4, and shall live is Romans 5-8. That's a Christian life.
Very cool.
And he had brilliant insights like that put the structure of Romans. And then the rest of Romans is just an extended, Romans 9, 10, 11 is just an extended response to the issue of what is the place of the Jew that is raised in Romans chapter 2. And then he tacks on pastoral implications at the end of it. And there you have the book of Romans. The other interesting thing was where he talks about Paul talks about the obedience of faith. And Cranfield points out obedience is faith and faith is obedience. You can't separate. Yeah,
beautiful.
And that phrase occurs at the beginning and end of Romans. And in a way, it's a bookend to everything in between, which is the entirety of the Christian life. So he had a lot of
that's just, mind-blowing insight. It's incredible. I love how the pastoral application of that is coming through as well, just in the way that you're explaining it and the way that he frames it all. You can hear how that would very simply communicate to a congregation as well. It's really powerful. Excellent. All right. So do you have any quotes that you can share with us from E.B. Cranfield? Maybe some of your favorite quotes?
I think that the gem was God created language for the purpose of proclamation of the gospel.
Beautiful.
I remember him. Of course, we had a political disagreement because he was sort of to the left. And I keep politics out of my preaching entirely. But anyway, we had a discussion one day, and a bit of chit chat at the end of a conversation or something. And I said, because at the time he had a Free Mandela poster in Mandela was in prison in South Africa. Then he said, Free Mandela poster in his window. And I said, I agree with that. However, what about the communist persecution of the church in Russia, which at that time, around 1980, was terrible?
Wow.
And he just looked at me and he said, David, the Russian communists don't understand what the gospel is. They have no real knowledge of God. He said, but South Africa, the white people in South Africa have been given a relatively pure form of the gospel, by which he meant the Reformed faith. And he said, they know the truth and they're denying it in the way that they act. So they're far more responsible than the Russians are before God. And I thought, he's right. He was right. Wow. He was absolutely right.
Wow, what a deep thought. Are there any sort of quirky things about him that you could share? I know you've shared that he's very shy, very pedantic, but any other stories that you have along that sort of vein?
Well, he wore black leather. He was typical of the Englishman of his generation. It was sort of tweed jacket, flannel trousers, black leather shoes, but he didn't wear socks.
What? So, oh, that's definitely a quirky, weird thing.
Like conservative, but no socks. And I thought, well, that's strange.
That's so strange.
And, like most Englishmen, again, I mean, he would have dressed that way every day of his life. Didn't matter what, he was just going to the supermarket. He never drove. Mrs. Cranfield was a vivacious lady from Northern Ireland, Northern Irish Presbyterian with a very broad Northern Irish accent. And she was very outgoing and friendly and all the rest. She was as outgoing as he was shy. And they married when they were, he was about 40 years old. Mrs. Cranfield was quite a bit younger. And they had twins. Mary and Elizabeth, who were born when he was, about 41 or something. And they were, when I first went to Durham, they were just finishing high school.
Oh, wow.
And he would write prayers with them every night. They would be written out Presbyterian style. And they both went on to be ministers in the Church of Scotland. Both of us.
Wow, that's beautiful. How powerful. Thank you, David. Is there anything else that you want to mention about Cranfield? Anything else that our listeners or watchers should know about him?
If you are studying, New Testament at any level, I just encourage you to get a copy of his Romans commentary, and you can get an abridged commentary. He did do a 1-volume abridged commentary where he laundered some of the technical stuff out of it, just like I did with G.K. Beale's Revelation, which is a bit easier to understand. But it's if you want a commentary that's really, I think, gets at the heart of Paul and expresses the heart of what Paul says, the bigger commentary, if you've got some Greek and so on, it's worth. You will get something out of it. Real meat in terms of preaching. So I when he died, N.T. Wright wrote an obituary and paid enormous tribute to him as a towering figure of his generation. And I think that he maintained a very conservative theological position. He wouldn't have been strictly down the line on biblical authority as we would be, but he was very, very much at the conservative end of the spectrum, and very conservative when it came to Paul. There's the odd point where he was influenced by Karl Barth, who was a mentor to him, and he was quite close to Karl Barth in one or two areas that we wouldn't agree with. But on the whole, you're getting the real deal. I think that when I get to meet the Apostle Paul, I think he'll be tell me he was pretty pleased with the way that Cranfield got it.
That's brilliant. And David, you've got many books. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about them? If anyone watching would like to dive into some of your books, what are they?
Yeah, thank you. I wrote a book called No Diving. It's 10 issues where we mess the Bible up and how to put them right. It's bite-sized. I wrote a super condensed version of a commentary on Revelation called Mystery Explained, or Guide to Understanding Revelation that anybody can understand. I have the last book that I published was a condensed version of my doctoral thesis, actually, which was on Paul's concept of Christian freedom. And it's entitled Exodus, The Road to Freedom in a Deconstructed World. And I do try to take some of the things which are very Cranfieldian, if I could use that word, and that I translated them into a way that I think actually the average church member can understand. And I address freedom is a subject that is central. If you don't understand a biblical concept of freedom, and particularly Pauline concept of freedom, you'll get the gospel all wrong. And so I take it and I apply it to all sorts of different areas, not just to areas like law, sin, and death, but to areas like citizenship, marriage, church government. And I even wandered into, pandemic responses, and because I think Christians were operating out of a wrong understanding of freedom, and often in their response to the pandemic. So that book is called Exodus, and Matt Chandler very kindly wrote a forward. And they're all available on Amazon.
Awesome.
I also wrote a book on suffering called Nightlight, which is a number of people that I knew that had gone through extreme suffering. They wrote their testimonies. It's a very, very powerful book. And I write a little commentary and teaching in between the testimonies and the stories. So it's kept me out of mischief.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely enough to keep you busy there. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today, David. It's been a true privilege to hear about your experience with Cranfield and just dive deeper into him. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us as well on the Eagle and Child podcast. We'll see you next time. Bye. Thanks so much for tuning into the Eagle and Child podcast. That's all from us for today. If you want to support us, you can like, subscribe, or drop us a review. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram @Eagle and Child Podcast. We'll catch you next time. Much love.